10 years was long enough that Oren Cassel had stopped being able to remember, with any real clarity, what the days had felt like before them. Not because the before was painful, or because memory had failed, simply because 10 years of a life built carefully and honestly with another person produces a kind of sediment, and the sediment becomes the ground you stand on. And after long enough, you stop thinking about the ground and simply stand on it. The river town had been Vale's suggestion, which he had initially received with the skepticism of a man raised in cities, and had been entirely converted from within the first winter. It was small enough that everyone knew the broad outlines of their neighbors' lives, and generous enough not to require the details. The river ran north to south at the town's edge, and the light it caught in the late afternoon was, in Oren's considered opinion, one of the finest arguments for remaining anywhere that he had encountered. He had mentioned this to his secondary school mathematics students on one occasion, and received the specific, tolerant attention of young people willing to grant adults their harmless enthusiasms. Vale's garden had become a source of quiet local celebrity over the years, not because she had cultivated it for any audience, but because she had cultivated it with the complete attention she gave to things she loved. And that quality of attention produces results that other people find themselves standing in front of and not entirely knowing why. The species she grew were from two worlds, though only one of those worlds was on the label. The combination had produced, over a decade, something that the Regional Horticultural Society had attempted to categorize and eventually simply documented, which was, Oren had told her, the correct response to things that didn't fit existing categories. Her long ears were as much a part of the town's landscape as the river by now. The secondary school students had stopped remarking on them by the third year, which was the accurate measure of when something had become ordinary, not when people approved of it, but when they stopped actively processing it. She wore her hair back in the garden and let them catch the light and carried the fact of herself, as she always had, without theater. They ate dinner early on Tuesdays, because Oren had a late class on Mondays that left him ready for sleep by 9, and the Tuesday routine had migrated to accommodate this. It was the specific, small calibration of two people who had learned each other's rhythms well enough to adjust for them without discussion, which was one of the things 10 years produced that the first year could not have predicted. The signal arrived on a Tuesday in early autumn while Oren was washing the dishes and Vale was at the table with her research notes. And the communications unit produced a frequency pattern she had not heard in a decade and would have recognized in her sleep. She was very still. He looked over with the peripheral attention of a man who had learned to read the quality of her stillness. "Vale," he said. "Yes," she said. "Sit down." She translated it completely, which he had known she would, because that was who she was, and that was what 10 years of building something honest together had made dishonesty into not a moral failure but a structural impossibility. A thing that the architecture of them no longer had room for. The formal Vahari summoning was not, she explained, the kind of communication that carried options in any of its standard registers. Her mother was ill in the specific, prognostic way of a Vahari matriarch whose succession protocols had triggered, not immediately, not without time, but irreversibly and with the particular timeline that the formal language of the transmission conveyed. The council seat required a blood presence at the transition. The transition required, in the Vahari tradition that she had explained to him in pieces over a decade, not only attendance, but a period of formal residency that the protocol defined in years rather than weeks. She laid it out completely, at the kitchen table, in the quiet voice she used for difficult things that she had decided to say fully rather than gradually. He listened without interrupting, which was how he listened to things that mattered. When she finished, he sat for a moment with his hands around his coffee cup in the way he had when he was thinking through something that needed thinking through properly. Then he said, "How long?" "The minimum formal residency is 2 years," she said. "In practice, for a matriarchal succession of this complexity, more likely 4. He nodded slowly. "The journey time," he said, "not a question exactly, more a place to put the next piece of the arithmetic. 6 months each direction," she said, "with current transit." He looked at his coffee. The kitchen was the same kitchen it had been 20 minutes ago, the same light, the same sounds from the garden where the autumn was doing what it did, the same house that had become over 10 years the most specific version of home either of them had inhabited. "What do you want to do?" he asked. She looked at him. "I don't know yet," she said, which was true and was the only honest answer, and which he received in the way he received true things, completely, without requiring it to be more resolved than it was. The weeks had the quality of a season that knows it is the last of something and proceeds anyway, which was the only way to proceed. They did not dramatize it. This was not a decision. It was a habit of character, the same habit that had built 10 years of honest, specific, undramatic life together in a river town where the afternoon light on the water was one of the better arguments for remaining anywhere. They were both, in their different ways, people who had found that the undramatic version of things was more durable than the dramatic one, and they applied this to the present difficulty without discussion because it did not require discussion. What they did instead was talk. On the river walk in the evenings, where the autumn had taken hold and the light came lower and longer across the water. In the garden in the mornings, where Vale moved through the things that needed doing before the cold came, and Oren sat on the bench by the southern wall and drank his coffee, and did not pretend that he was thinking about anything other than what he was thinking about. At the kitchen table, where the most honest conversations of their decade had consistently taken place, as though the table had accumulated over time a quality of truth-telling that rooms acquire from habitual use. He did not ask her to stay. She knew this was not the absence of wanting her to. It was the presence of knowing that she was a person whose choices needed to be her own to be real, and that asking would change the shape of the choice in ways that would make it less hers, and that 10 years of knowing her had made this understanding so structural that it no longer felt like generosity. It felt like simply being accurate about who she was. She did not ask him to follow, because following was a one-directional word for something that Vahari transit and human biology made one-directional in fact, and she was a person who had always preferred the accurate version of things to the comfortable one, and the accurate version was that following was not available in any form that the word together survived. "Do you remember," Oren said, on the river walk one evening, the first winter, when you decided the garden needed a second section along the north wall, and you drew the plans for 3 weeks, and I kept suggesting that we just buy a shed? "You were wrong about the shed," she said. "I was completely wrong about the shed," he agreed. "But I remember you explaining to me, very patiently, that the north wall had a microclimate that the rest of the garden didn't have, and that the species you wanted to grow there couldn't go anywhere else, and that the fact that the space was difficult was actually why it was the right space for them." She was quiet, watching the river. "I've been thinking about that explanation," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the water with the expression he wore when he had been thinking about something long enough to have thought it through properly and was now saying it for the first time. "I know," she said. "I haven't said it yet," he said. "I know what you're going to say," she said. "I've known for about a week." He almost smiled. And she looked at the river and the autumn light on it and the town behind them that had been ordinary in the best possible way for 10 years. "And I've been running the same arithmetic," she said, "and arriving at the same place and not quite knowing what to do with the fact that we've both arrived there without talking about it." "It's very efficient of us," he said. "It is," she said. "It's almost suspicious." The river moved in its patient, indifferent way, a thing that had been running longer than either of them and would be running after, which was not a melancholy thought from where she stood but a clarifying one. A reminder of scale that made the choice in front of her feel more rather than less important, because the choices that matter are the ones made against the background of how much time there is and how little of it belongs to any particular life. The message to the Vahari Council took her 3 days to compose, which was shorter than she had expected and longer than she would have liked, and produced a document that was formally correct in every structural detail and unprecedented in its content. She was not refusing the summons. She had thought carefully about this distinction and found it not only accurate but necessary. She was honoring the summons in the specific way that honoring something meant giving it your full, honest response rather than your compliant one. She was attending the succession. She was fulfilling the formal requirements of her family's council seat. She was doing all of this. She was doing it with her husband. The Vahari succession protocols had, in 4 centuries of formal documentation, no provision for a matriarchal designate arriving at a family council seat accompanied by a human spouse. Because in 4 centuries of formal documentation, no matriarchal designate had done so. This was not, Vale had concluded, because it was prohibited. It was because it had not previously been necessary. The protocols were silent on the matter in the specific way that documents are silent on situations they did not anticipate, not forbidding, simply unprepared. She had written this argument in the precise, evidenced language that the council respected, because she was who she was and she made cases the way she made cases. Completely, with the full weight of the supporting structure visible, without simplifying the parts that were complicated. She submitted it and sat at the kitchen table and looked at Orin, who had read it over her shoulder and was now looking at it with the expression of a man who had followed an argument to its conclusion, and found the conclusion both correct and somewhat larger than he had been prepared for. "I want to be clear," he said, "that I didn't ask you to do this." "I know," she said. "That's partly why I did." He was quiet for a moment. "Partly," she said. "The other part is that it's correct. It's the right answer to the question. The protocols don't prohibit it. The summons requires my presence, not my solitude. And the council seat requires someone who has spent 10 years developing the kind of understanding that 47 categories of formal assessment don't produce." She paused. "You've spent 10 years developing that understanding. You've been paying attention." "I've been teaching secondary school mathematics," he said. "You've been teaching people how to think about things that feel impossible until you break them into their components," she said. "That's the same skill." He looked at her with the full, unhurried attention of a man who had been known completely for 10 years and was encountering, in this moment, a new piece of the person he thought he already knew entirely. "4 years," he said. "Minimum," she said. "And then back here," he said. "And then back here," she said. "The garden will need someone to look after it." "The neighbor's daughter has been asking," he said. "I know," she said. "I've been teaching her the North Wall microclimate." He looked at her. She looked at him. The kitchen was the same light, the same house that had become over 10 years the most specific version of home either of them had ever inhabited.